A giant cowboy only knew country life until a city girl asked to sleep with him for safety. Out a lonely frontier night, the wind howls through the cottonwoods and a lantern flickers in a ranch shack. A towering cowboy, hardened by years of cattle and storms, opens his door to a stranger, a city woman in torn silks, trembling with fear. She begs for shelter, but with her arrival comes danger no rifle can keep out. By morning, it's clear she carries more than fear in her saddlebag. Shadows on horseback circle the land, hired guns who will stop at nothing to take the ranch. And the secret she holds could save him or ruin him forever. As the church bell tolls and hooves thunder down the dusty street, the frontier will test the line between trust and betrayal, faith and despair. Can a man who only knew country life trust a city girl who asks to share his fire? Or will her hidden ties cost him everything he loves? Every story I share leads with love. For people, for healing. For the things we sometimes forget to say out loud, dot the setting sun painted long shadows across the weathered boards of Daniel Boone's line shack as he struck a match against the rough wooden table. The flame caught the wick of his old brass lantern, casting a warm glow through the simple one-room shelter. His muscles ached from a full day of mending fences along the western edge of his Colorado ranch, the kind of honest work that left a man bone-tired but satisfied. Daniel settled onto a straight-back chair, the wood creaking beneath him. Steam rose from the tin plate of beans and cornbread before him. A humble meal, but filling enough after hours in the saddle. The only sounds were the soft crackle of the cook stove and the evening wind whistling through the prairie grass outside. The sudden knock at his door nearly made him drop his fork. Daniel froze, listening. Out here, 20 miles from the nearest town, visitors after sunset usually meant trouble. The knock came again, more urgent this time. He reached for his Winchester rifle, keeping it close as he approached the door. "Who's there?" "Please," came a woman's voice, trembling and desperate. "I need help." Daniel opened the door cautiously, rifle at the ready. His eyes widened at the sight before him. A young woman stood on his threshold, her fine traveling dress torn and dusty. She was shaking, whether from cold or fear he couldn't tell, though her bearing spoke of money and Eastern refinement even in her current state. "I'm Carmen Whitfield," she said, her voice stronger than her appearance suggested. "Our stagecoach was stopped by armed men. I managed to slip away while they were distracted, but I've been walking for hours." She lifted her chin, though her hands were clasped tightly together. "Please let me sleep here for safety." Daniel's jaw tightened. City folk meant complications, and complications were the last thing he needed. Yet leaving a woman alone on the prairie at night went against everything his parents had taught him about right and wrong. "Come in," he said finally, stepping back from the door, but just for tonight. Relief washed over her face as she hurried inside. She made straight for the cook stove, holding her hands out to the warmth. The lamplight revealed smudges of dirt on her face and tears in her skirts that spoke of a desperate flight through brush and thorns. "Much obliged," she said softly, using the Western phrase with careful precision, like someone speaking a foreign language. Daniel shut and bolted the door, then returned to his cooling supper. He watched as she took in the spare furnishings of his shack, the narrow bed against one wall, the rough shelves holding basic provisions, the saddle and tack hanging from pegs. "How'd someone like you end up out here alone?" he asked, unable to keep the suspicion from his voice. Carmen turned from the stove, her shoulders straight despite her obvious exhaustion. "I was traveling to Denver to meet my father. He's looking to expand his banking interests out west." She paused, swallowing hard. The stage stopped suddenly. I heard shouting, then gunshots. When the men were arguing over the strongbox, I slipped out the far side and ran. Daniel studied her as she spoke. Her story seemed truthful enough, though experience had taught him that truth could be as dangerous as lies out here. "You're lucky you found this place. Nearest town's 20-Mile Creek, and that's a full day's walk. I followed the fence line." She admitted. "I figured it had to lead somewhere." Despite himself, Daniel was impressed by her practical thinking. Still, one night was all he could risk. Come morning, he'd have to ride her into town, which meant losing a day's work on the ranch. "You can sleep by the fire," he said, gesturing to the space near the stove. "I've got some extra blankets." He patted the rifle now propped against his chair. "I'll keep watch. Make sure those men didn't follow you." Carmen nodded, accepting his terms without argument. The silence stretched between them, filled with unspoken questions and the vast cultural divide between their worlds. She was clearly unused to such rough accommodations, yet she made no complaints as Daniel dug out the promised blankets from the trunk. "Would you like some supper?" He found himself asking, surprising them both. "It ain't fancy, but it's hot." "Dang. You," she said quietly. "I haven't eaten since breakfast." Daniel scraped half his beans and cornbread onto another plate, watching as she settled onto a wooden crate he'd pulled up near the stove. She ate carefully, but with obvious hunger, managing the simple fare with more grace than he'd expected. Evening wore on in awkward silence. Daniel caught himself stealing glances at his unexpected guest, noting how the lamplight caught the auburn highlights in her dark hair, how she held herself with dignity despite her disheveled state. It had been a long time since he'd shared his space with anyone, let alone a woman who clearly belonged in the parlors and opera houses of the East Dot. As Carmen finished her meal, she looked up to find him watching there. "I know this must be terribly irregular," she said, "having a stranger impose on your hospitality like this." "Reckon it is," Daniel agreed, his voice gruff. "But a man can't turn away someone in need, even if they are city folk." He immediately regretted the slight edge in his words, but Carmen merely gave him a tired smile. "The West isn't quite what I expected," she admitted, "though I'm grateful for its unexpected kindnesses." Daniel shifted uncomfortably under her direct gaze. He wasn't used to such frank conversation, especially with a woman of her class. The small shack suddenly felt even smaller, crowded with unspoken thoughts and a strange tension between his rough frontier life and her evident refinement. "Best get some rest," he said, rising to bank the stove for the night. "I'll wake you at first light. We'll need to ride into town, let the sheriff know about those men who stopped the stage." Carmen arranged the blankets near the stove's warmth, making a neat pallet on the plank floor. Daniel settled back in his chair, rifle across his knees, preparing for a long night of watching both his unexpected guest and the darkness beyond his windows dot the lamplight cast dancing shadows on the walls as Carmen lay down, still fully dressed. Despite her obvious exhaustion, she looked over at him one last time. "Thank you, Mr. Boone. I won't forget this kindness." Daniel only nodded, not trusting himself to speak. As Carmen drifted off to sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that his carefully ordered life had just been upset in ways he couldn't yet understand. The night stretched ahead, full of questions and the soft sound of Carmen's breathing, while outside, the vast Colorado prairie waited in darkness. The first rays of dawn crept through the cabin's single window, painting the rough-hewn walls with pale golden light. Carmen stirred from her makeshift bed by the now-cooled stove, while Daniel had already been awake for hours, his rifle still close at hand. "I'm much obliged for the shelter," Carmen said, smoothing her crumpled dress. She hesitated, twisting her hands together. "But I fear I have nowhere else to go. Those men who stopped the stage, they might still be watching the roads." Daniel frowned, his weathered face creasing with concern. "Stay put. I'll scout the stage road." He stepped outside into the crisp morning air, quickly saddling his bay horse. The animal's breath came out in white puffs as Daniel swung into the saddle. He rode out along the fence line, following it to where it intersected with the stage road dot there in the dirt. The story of last night's trouble was written clear as day. Daniel dismounted, crouching to study the ground. 3 sets of horseshoes had left distinct marks heavy draft horses, probably stolen from some freight outfit. The tracks circled back toward his land, confirming Carmen's fears. When Daniel returned to the cabin, he found Carmen struggling with the coffee pot over the cook stove. Black smoke curled up from the spout as she frantically tried to remove it from the heat. Here now, Daniel said, moving quickly to take the pot before it was ruined. Instead of the mockery she clearly expected, he set the pot aside and pulled out a clean one. Let me show you the proper way. I'm sorry, Carmen said, her cheeks flushing. I thought I could manage something so simple. Coffee's got its own ways, Daniel said, measuring out the grounds. You want to let the water just start to bubble, not boil fierce. Then add the grounds gentle-like and let it steep. He demonstrated each step, and to his surprise, Carmen watched with complete attention, asking careful questions about the timing and temperature as the coffee brewed properly this time. Carmen noticed the worn leather strap on Daniel's saddle where he dropped it by the door. Without a word, she retrieved a small sewing kit from her pocket and began examining the tier. Mind if I fix this? She asked, already threading a needle dot. Daniel watched, skeptical, as she began working on the strap. But her stitches were small and precise, following the original pattern exactly. Within minutes, she had reinforced the leather better than he could have done himself. Where'd you learn to do that? He asked, unable to hide his surprise. Carmen smiled slightly. My mother insisted I learn practical skills, not just piano and painting. She said a woman never knows when she might need them. Her smile faded. She passed last winter. Daniel felt an unexpected pang of sympathy. Lost my folks 3 years back. Fever took them both within a week of each other. They shared a moment of quiet understanding before Carmen swayed slightly on her feet. Daniel noticed the dark circles. Under her eyes, the way she steadied herself against the wall. When's the last time you ate proper? He asked. 2 days ago at the last stage stop, she admitted. I was too nervous to eat much then. Without another word, Daniel pulled out his cast iron skillet and set about frying up bacon. He mixed biscuit dough while the meat sizzled, working quickly and efficiently. Soon the cabin filled with the homey smells of breakfast. They ate together, at his small table, and when Carmen told a gentle joke about her coffee-making attempts, Daniel found himself laughing for the first time in longer than he could remember. Her own laugh was warm and genuine, without the affected tittering he'd expected from a banker's daughter. As evening approached, Daniel found himself hesitating over the decision he knew he had to make. The tracks he'd found meant it wasn't safe for Carmen to leave yet, and somehow the thought of sending her away didn't sit right anymore. You can stay another night, he said finally, but I'll keep watch outside. Safer that way. Carmen nodded, relief clear on her face. Thank you, Mr. Boone. Daniel, he corrected, surprising himself. Mr. Boone was my father. After supper, Daniel took his rifle and bedroll outside, settling into a spot where he could watch both the cabin and the approach from the stage road. The night was clear, with 1,000 stars scattered across the dark sky like diamond dust. Through the cabin's window, he could see Carmen moving about, banking the stove for the night. She paused at the window, looking out at where he sat against an old oak tree. Their eyes met briefly before she turned away, drawing the curtain. Inside, Carmen wrapped herself in the borrowed blankets, feeling the day's tension slowly ease from her shoulders. She could see Daniel's silhouette against the starlit sky through a gap in the curtain. Despite everything, the stage robbery, her flight across the prairie, and the uncertainty ahead, she felt safer than she had since leaving Boston. The night settled around them both, filled with the soft sounds of prairie wind through the grass and the distant cry of a coyote. Daniel kept his vigil under the stars, his thoughts turning again and again to the surprising woman who had disrupted his solitary life. She wasn't what he'd expected, not just some helpless city girl, but someone with hidden depths and unexpected strengths. He found himself wondering what other surprises Carmen Whitfield might reveal, then quickly pushed the thought away. She'd be leaving soon enough, returning to her world of banks and Boston society. Best not to dwell on what couldn't be. Yet as the night deepened, Daniel couldn't help but remember the way she'd laughed at breakfast, or how precisely she'd stitched his saddle strap. Small things, perhaps, but they spoke of a practical nature behind her refined manners. Despite his best intentions, he was beginning to see Carmen as more than just an inconvenient guest. She was becoming a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out, and one he wasn't sure he wanted to solve. Morning brought a gentle breeze across the Colorado prairie, rustling the tall grass around Daniel's line shack. Carmen stood at the wooden water pump, working the handle with determination. The metal creaked in protest, producing only a weak trickle. Creak might be easier, Daniel called from where he was stacking logs. Pump's temperamental this time. Of year, Carmen smoothed her skirts, now dusty and wrinkled from sleep. I'd be happy to fetch water from the creek. It's the least I can do for your hospitality. Daniel hesitated, then nodded toward 2 wooden buckets. Creek's just beyond those cottonwoods. Stay within sight of the cabin. Carmen lifted the buckets, their worn handles smooth from years of use. The morning air was cool against her face as she made her way down the gentle slope. Behind her, the rhythmic thunk of Daniel's axe splitting wood echoed across the yard dot at the creek. Carmen knelt carefully on a flat rock, dipping each bucket into the clear water. The sound of flowing water mixed with birdsong and the continued chopping from up the hill. For a moment, she felt an unexpected peace. Daniel paused in his work, watching Carmen make her way back up the slope. She carried the buckets with careful steps, water sloshing gently. Not like a city woman at all, he thought, noting her steady progress despite the weight. The crack of a rifle shot shattered the morning calm. Carmen stumbled, water splashing her skirts as Daniel dropped his axe and sprinted for the cabin. "Get inside," he shouted. "Bar the door." She hurried to comply, her heart pounding as Daniel emerged moments later with his rifle and saddle. He mounted quickly, his face grim. "Don't open for anyone but me." "I'll knock 3 times, pause then twice." "More." Carmen watched from the window as he rode toward the ridge where the shot had come from, his figure growing smaller against the vast landscape. The water buckets stood forgotten by the door, one tipped over in her haste. Daniel rode hard across, his pasture scanning the ground for signs of trouble. The morning sun cast long shadows through the grass, making it difficult to spot details. Then he saw it, a dark shape lying still in the grass. One of his calves lay dead, a clean shot through the head. This was no hunting accident. The precision of the kill spoke of deliberate malice. Daniel dismounted, examining the ground around the carcass. 3 sets of horse tracks led away toward town. The sheriff's office in town was a simple wooden building, with a worn American flag hanging limp in the still air. Sheriff Wheeler looked up from his desk as Daniel entered, dust from the ride still clinging to his clothes. "Found one of my calves shot dead," Daniel said without preamble. "Clean kill, professional work." Wheeler's weathered face creased with concern. "Ain't the first trouble we've had. 3 hired guns rode through last week. Working for that railroad syndicate. Way I hear it." "What syndicate?" "Eastern outfit. Been buying up land all through the territory. Some folks say they don't take kindly to ranchers who won't sell." Wheeler scratched his graying beard. "Might want to watch your back, Daniel." Daniel's jaw tightened. "Much obliged for the warning, Sheriff." At the general store, Carmen kept her head down as she gathered basic supplies, flour, coffee, sugar. Her father had taught her to always repay hospitality, and Daniel's pantry was running low. As she waited at the counter, 2 men entered, speaking in low voices. "Boston Bank's backing the whole expansion," one whispered. Whitfield himself signed the papers. "Railroad's getting all the funding they need." Carmen's hands trembled as she gripped the counter. Whitfield, her father's bank. The same bank she'd fled from, refusing an arranged marriage to the vice president's son. Now she understood why those men had targeted her stagecoach. They weren't simple robbers. The store bell jingled as Daniel entered, nodding briefly to Carmen. Before speaking with the shopkeeper about ammunition, Carmen paid quickly for her supplies, her mind racing. How could she tell him? The shame of her family's involvement burned in her chest. The ride back to the cabin was silent. Biaknen's son beating down on them? Carmen's guilt felt as heavy as the sack of supplies in her lap. Several times she opened her mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. That evening, as they sat at Daniel's rough-hewn table, Carmen finally broke the silence. "Those men who stopped the stage," she said softly, "they're dangerous. Professional men, not common bandits." She twisted her. Hands in her lap? They won't stop until they get what they want. What they want. Daniel's face hardened in the lamplight. This is my parents' land. Built this ranch with their own hands. He stood, pacing the small cabin. I don't care who these men work for. I won't be driven off. Carmen watched him, her heart aching. Very presence was putting him in danger, yet she couldn't bring herself to reveal the full truth. Not yet, not when he'd shown her such kindness. The lamp flickered, casting dancing shadows on the wall. Outside, a coyote called lonely across the prairie. Carmen stared into her cup of cooling coffee, seeing her reflection distorted in the dark. Liquid. The weight of her secret pressed down on her. Heavy as storm clouds on the horizon, Daniel stood at the window, his rifle close at hand, scanning the darkness beyond the glass. His stance was protective, determined. Carmen couldn't help but wonder, would that determination turn to hatred when he discovered who she really was? Would he understand that she'd had no knowledge of her father's dealings? The night settled around them, full of unspoken words and growing tension. Carmen's wooden chair creaked as she shifted, each sound seeming to underscore the gravity of her situation. She was trapped between loyalty to her family and the knowledge that their business dealings threatened to destroy the life of a good man. The cabin suddenly felt too small, too intimate. Every time Daniel looked at her with those trust-hardened eyes, her shame grew deeper. She had to find a way to make this right, but for now, all she could do was watch him standing guard against enemies he didn't fully understand, enemies connected to her own blood. The morning sun climbed higher as Daniel and Carmen rode along the north pasture fence line. Daniel sat easy in his saddle, while Carmen tried not to show how the hours of riding had left her muscles aching. Her borrowed work dress was more practical than her city clothes, but she still felt every bump and jostle. Fence looks solid here, Daniel called over his shoulder, scanning the wire for signs of tampering. His eyes never stopped moving, watching the surrounding hills for any sign of trouble. Carmen guided her horse carefully alongside his. I'm managing fine, she said, answering his unspoken question about her stamina. Though I admit I'll be feeling this ride tomorrow. A hint of approval crossed Daniel's face. You ride better than most city folk I've met. The prairie stretched out around them, a sea of grass rippling in the warm breeze. Red-tailed hawks circled overhead, their cries carrying across the empty landscape. Carmen's horse nickered softly as they approached a massive old cottonwood tree standing sentinel near the fence line. We'll rest here, Daniel said, dismounting. Get out of the sun for a spell. Carmen slid carefully from her saddle, trying not to wince. They secured the horses in the shade and settled beneath the spreading branches. Daniel pulled bread and dried beef from his saddlebag, offering Carmen her share. The cottonwood's leaves rustled above them, a peaceful sound at odds with the tension of watching for threats. Carmen broke the silence first. Why do you distrust city people so much? Daniel was quiet for a long moment, breaking a piece of bread into smaller chunks. 5 years back, some fancy-talking fellows from Denver came around. Said they represented Eastern investors wanted to buy up ranch land for development. His jaw tightened. 3 families sold. Within a year, their land was stripped bare and abandoned. Those city men had taken their money and run. Not all of us are like that, Carmen said softly. No, Daniel agreed, meeting her eyes. Reckon you've shown more courage than most, running from whatever trouble found you? He paused, though I'm starting to think that trouble followed you here. Carmen looked away, guilt twisting in her stomach. Before she could respond, Daniel was on his feet. We should head back. Don't want to be out in the open too long. The ride home was quieter, both lost in their own thoughts. As they crested the final rise above Daniel's ranch, he suddenly reined his horse to a stop. Something's wrong. Near the water trough, several cattle lay on their sides, clearly ill. Others stood with heads hanging low, refusing to drink. Daniel spurred his horse forward, Carmen close behind. The sharp chemical smell hit them before. They reached the trough. Daniel dipped a finger in the water and touched it to his tongue, immediately spitting. Lie. They poisoned the water. Carmen was already moving, pulling her horse toward the cabin. "I need my traveling bag," she called over her shoulder. "And clean water, as much as you can get from the creek." Daniel stared after her, confused, but did as she asked. When he returned with 2 buckets of fresh water, Carmen had her bag open on the porch, sorting through small paper packets and glass bottles. "My friend Sarah apprenticed with an apothecary," Carmen explained, measuring portions of dried herbs into a pot of heating water. "She taught me about treating sick animals. Lye burns can be helped with vinegar solutions and herbal poultices." The next several hours, Carmen worked tirelessly among the sick cattle. She showed Daniel how to mix the treatments and apply them, her hands sure and gentle with the suffering animals. The sun was setting by the time they finished, their clothes stained with mud and medicine. 3 might not make it through the night, Carmen said wearily as they walked back to the cabin. "But the other should recover." Daniel nodded, his expression troubled. "Never seen anything like what you did today. Those medicines of yours." He trailed off, shaking his head in amazement inside the cabin. Carmen sank into a chair while Daniel built up the fire. The familiar evening routine felt different now, heavy with things unsaid. Carmen watched the flames grow stronger, gathering her courage. "Daniel," she began, her voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something." She took a deep breath. "In town yesterday, I overheard men talking about the syndicate, about which bank was funding their expansion." Her hands trembled in her lap. "It's my father's bank in Boston." The silence that followed was deafening. Daniel stood perfectly still, his back to her, one hand gripping the mantel above the fireplace. "I swear I didn't know," Carmen continued, fighting back tears. "Not until yesterday. I left Boston to escape an arranged marriage, but now I wonder if there was more behind it all." Daniel finally turned to face her, his expression unreadable in the firelight. "Get some rest," he said, his voice rough. "Tomorrow we'll need to prepare. They won't stop at poisoning water." Carmen rose unsteadily, pausing at the door to the small side room where she slept. "I'm sorry," she whispered. Daniel didn't respond, just stood staring into the fire. Alone in her room, Carmen knelt beside her bed, clasping her hands in prayer. "Lord," she whispered, "give me wisdom. Show me how to make this right." Tears slid down her cheeks as she continued. "Give me courage to stand for truth, even if it means losing my family's approval. And please," she glanced toward the main room where Daniel kept his lonely vigil, "please help him understand I want to help." The fire crackled in the other room, its light seeping under her door. Outside, the wind whispered through the prairie grass, carrying the night sounds of the ranch. Carmen stayed on her knees, praying. In the darkness, knowing tomorrow would test them both in ways they weren't prepared for, the next morning dawned gray and cool, with heavy clouds promising rain. Daniel stood on his porch, reading the foreclosure notice for the 10th time, his jaw clenched tight. Carmen watched him from the doorway, her hands twisted in her apron. "I'm coming with you to town," she said firmly. Daniel shook his head. "This is my fight." "Those papers involve banking matters," Carmen insisted, stepping closer. "I grew up watching my father handle contracts. I might see something you'd miss." Daniel looked at her for a long moment, then nodded curtly. "Saddle up, then." "We're burning." Daylight. The ride to town was tense and silent. Their horses' hooves kicked up dust from the dry road as thunder rumbled in the distance. Carmen's mind raced, thinking of every banking trick she'd overheard in her father's study. The land office sat at the end of the muddy main street, its weathered sign creaking in the rising wind. Inside, the clerk barely glanced up from his ledger. As they entered, his spectacles caught the dim light as he finally acknowledged them with cold indifference. "Mr. Boone," the clerk drawled. "I assume you're here about the notice." "This is my land," Daniel said, his voice low and controlled. "Paid for fair and square with the bank in Denver." The clerk shuffled through some papers. "Your note has been legally purchased by the Western Expansion Syndicate. They're calling it due immediately." "That's impossible," Daniel growled. "I've never missed a payment." Carmen stepped forward. "May I see the paperwork, please?" The clerk hesitated, but Daniel's stern presence made him relent. He handed over several documents, which Carmen spread carefully on the counter. Her fingers traced each line methodically, her brow furrowed in concentration. "These dates don't align," she murmured, comparing 2 pages. "And this signature?" She looked closer. "The ink is fresher than the rest." Daniel leaned in. "What does that mean?" "It means," Carmen said slowly, "that someone has altered these documents recently." She pointed to several discrepancies, her voice growing stronger. "The original terms are still visible under this correction. And this notary stamp. It's dated 3 months ago, but claims to validate a transfer from last week." The clerk's face had grown pale. He snatched the papers back. "The syndicate's claim is legal and binding." "Good day." "We'll fight this," Daniel declared, his hand resting meaningfully on his gun belt. "The syndicate has already filed the changes," the clerk said nervously. "You have 3 days to vacate." Outside, the first fat drops of rain began to fall. Daniel helped Carmen mount up, then swung into his own saddle. "What you saw in there?" he said as they rode home. "Could it help us?" "Yes," Carmen nodded. "But we'd need proof of the original documents." And time. They rode the rest of the way in thoughtful silence, the storm building around them. As they approached the ranch, Daniel suddenly reined his horse to a halt. His face hardened as he stared at the barn. Crude letters had been painted across the wooden door in dark red. "Leave before it's too late." "Get inside," Daniel ordered, scanning the surrounding hills. Now, Carmen hurried to the cabin while Daniel checked the barn and outbuildings. Finding no intruders, he spent the next hour reinforcing the barn door and positioning rifles within easy reach of both the cabin and the barn. The storm broke in earnest as evening fell. Rain drummed on the cabin roof while Daniel and Carmen sat at the small table, their supper barely touched. Lightning flashed outside, illuminating their worried faces. "I could write to my father," Carmen said finally. "Tell him what's happening. He might not know how the syndicate is using his bank's name." "How long would that take?" Daniel asked. 2 weeks to reach Boston. Perhaps another week for his reply. Carmen pushed her plate away. "The syndicate won't wait that long." Daniel stood and added wood to the fire. "Then we hold our ground," he said grimly, "until we can prove the truth." Thunder crashed overhead, making the cabin windows rattle. Carmen pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders and moved closer to the fire. After a moment, Daniel joined her there. The storm's fury seemed to press them closer together in the small cabin. Carmen was acutely aware of Daniel's presence. Beside her, of the strength and warmth radiating from him. Despite everything, or perhaps because of it, she felt safer than she had in months. Daniel stared into the flames, his profile stern in the flickering light. "Why did you really leave Boston?" he asked softly. Carmen drew a shaky breath. "My father arranged a marriage to a business partner's son, a man I'd met twice." She wrapped her arms around herself. "You cared more about merging bank accounts than my happiness." Daniel nodded slowly. "And now you're here, fighting alongside a rancher against your own family's business." "I'm fighting for what's right," Carmen said firmly. "That matters more than any family name." Another crack of thunder shook the cabin. Daniel rose to check the windows while Carmen added more wood to the fire. When he returned to his seat, he sat slightly closer than before. "Whatever comes," he said quietly, "I'm grateful you're here." Carmen felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the fire. They sat together in companionable silence as the storm raged on, each drawing strength from the other's presence. Knowing that darker days lay ahead, the flames danced before them, casting their shadows on the wall, 2 figures drawn together by circumstance, now united against a common enemy. Outside, the rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the darkness, unseen threats waited. But for now, in this moment, they had found something neither expected: trust, understanding, and perhaps the beginning of something more. The first rays of dawn painted the Colorado sky in shades of pink and gold when the sound of wagon wheels caught Daniel's attention. He stepped onto the porch, rifle ready, only to see Mrs. Tilson's familiar buggy approaching, followed by several riders on horseback. The elderly rancher woman pulled her buggy to a stop, her gray hair neatly pinned beneath a faded bonnet. "News. Travels fast," she called out, lifting a covered basket. "Thought you might need some sustenance for the fight ahead." Carmen emerged from the cabin, wiping her hands on her apron. The morning light caught her face, showing dark circles under her eyes from the restless night. "Land sakes, girl," Mrs. Tilson said, climbing down. "Come help an old woman with these pies. Made them fresh this morning, apple and cherry." Behind her, 3 young cowhands from neighboring ranches dismounted. Tom Wheeler, the oldest at 25, stepped forward. "Mr. Boone, we heard about the syndicate's threats. Pa sent us to help watch the cattle." Daniel's throat tightened at this show of support. "Much obliged," he managed. Carmen took the basket from Mrs. Tilson, then paused, her eyes brightening. "What we need is a proper gathering," she declared. "Tomorrow's Sunday. We could meet here, pray together, show those syndicate men that Daniel isn't standing alone." Daniel shifted uncomfortably. "Now, hold on. That's fine thinking," Mrs. Tilson interrupted. "I'll spread the word. The barn's big enough." Carmen was already moving with purpose. "We'll need coffee, bread. I can make stew." She began listing items on a scrap of paper. Daniel watched her take charge with mixed feelings. Part of him bristled at how quickly she'd taken over, but he couldn't help admiring her quick mind and determination. She moved about the yard with growing confidence, so different from the frightened woman who had appeared at his door just days ago. Through the morning, more neighbors arrived. The Petersons brought fresh bread and butter. The Wilson boys came with extra ammunition. Carmen organized everything with quiet efficiency, directing people to store food in the root cellar and stack firewood by the barn. By mid-afternoon on Sunday, wagons and riders streamed into the ranch yard. Women spread tablecloths over hay, bales setting out pies and cornbread. Men gathered in clusters, discussing cattle and weather while keeping careful watch on the surrounding hills. Preacher Amos Tilson arrived in his dusty black coat, well-worn Bible tucked under his arm. His presence seemed to make the gathering official. The barn doors stood wide open, fresh hay scattered over the floor to accommodate the crowd. "Brothers and sisters," the preacher's voice carried over the murmur of conversation. "Let us lift our voices in praise, even in troubled times." The familiar notes of Amazing Grace filled the barn, voices joining together, strong and sure. Daniel stood near the back, overwhelmed by the sight of his neighbors filling the space. Carmen's clear voice rose with the others, and he found himself watching her, struck by how naturally she fit into this gathering of frontier folk. When the hymn ended, Carmen stepped forward. Her hands were clasped tightly, but her voice was steady. "I know some of you wonder why I'm still here," she began. "I came from Boston, running from men who meant harm. Daniel took me in when I had nowhere else to go." She paused, meeting Daniel's startled gaze. "I've seen the beauty of this land, the strength of this community. I've also seen the greed that threatens it. I want you all to know I'm staying. I'll fight alongside Daniel, and all of you to protect what's right." A murmur ran through the crowd. Mrs. Tilson was the first to speak. "Amen, child. We need more folk with backbone out here." "Amen," others echoed. And soon the barn rang with voices of support. Daniel felt something shift inside him, like ice breaking up in spring. Since losing his parents to fever 3 years ago, he'd held himself apart, convinced that self-reliance was the only way to survive. Now, surrounded by neighbors, watching Carmen stand straight and proud as she declared her commitment to this life, he felt the walls around his heart beginning to crumble. The gathering continued as afternoon faded. To evening, Preacher Tilson led more hymns and a prayer for protection. People shared stories and laughter over coffee and pie. Through it all, Daniel noticed how naturally Carmen moved among them, learning names, listening to tales of drought and good harvests, offering encouragement and practical help. As stars began to shimmer in the darkening sky, the last wagons rolled away. Daniel and Carmen sat on the porch, the peaceful aftermath of the gathering settling around them. She had his old work shirt in her lap, carefully stitching a torn sleeve. He worked quietly beside her, oiling a piece of harness leather, the familiar. Sounds of night surrounded them, crickets chirping, the soft nickering of horses in the barn, the rustle of wind in the cottonwoods. Daniel watched Carmen's sure movements with the needle, remembering how she'd stood in the barn, claiming this life as her own. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with shared purpose and unspoken understanding. Each stitch Carmen made seemed to bind her more firmly to this place, to the life she'd chosen. Daniel felt the weight of loneliness he'd carried for so long beginning to lift, replaced by something warmer, something that felt remarkably like hope. Hope. The stars multiplied overhead as they worked, their quiet industry a testament to the partnership they'd forged. No words were needed to express the strength they'd found in standing together, supported by the community that had rallied around them. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them not just as two individuals, but as part of something larger, a community bound together by faith, determination, and the unyielding spirit of the frontier. The morning sun cast long shadows across the trail as Daniel and Carmen rode toward the trading post. Their horses' hooves kicked up small clouds of dust, and the late summer breeze carried the scent of sage and prairie grass. They needed supplies, flour, coffee, and ammunition, but Daniel found himself in no hurry, content to match the easy pace Carmen set. "Tell me about Boston," Daniel said, surprising himself. Usually, he avoided talk of city life, but Carmen's presence had sparked a curiosity he couldn't deny. Carmen's face brightened. "Oh, the theaters. Gas lamps line the boulevards, making everything glow like daylight at night. Ladies in silk dresses sweep past gentlemen in tall hats." She laughed softly. "The music halls fill with violin music, and sometimes they put on Shakespeare plays." "Shakespeare?" Daniel raised an eyebrow. "Reckon that's a mite fancier than camp songs around the fire." "Different, not fancier," Carmen corrected gently. "I've grown to love the way coyotes harmonize at dusk. It's nature's own theater." She turned in her saddle. "What about you? Tell me about your cattle drives." Daniel's weather-worn face softened as memories surfaced. "The longest drive I ever made was 3 months. 2,000 head of cattle from here to Kansas City. Lost half my crew to dysentery. Had to train 3 green boys mid-trail." He shook his head. Then came the blizzard. "In summer?" Carmen's eyes widened. Mountain weather's got its own mind. "Snow hit us hard in a high pass. Had to hole up in a cave for 4 days, listening to the wind howl like 1,000 wolves." His voice grew quiet. "Lost some good cattle, but brought every man home alive." Carmen leaned forward, eager to hear more, when suddenly her horse stepped into a prairie dog hole. The animal stumbled heavily, pitching forward. Carmen let out a startled cry as she was thrown from the saddle. Dog Daniel was off his horse in an instant, heart pounding. Carmen lay still in the grass, and for one terrible moment, fear gripped him. He knelt beside her, gently cradling her head. "Carmen, can you hear me?" Her eyes fluttered open, meeting his worried gaze. "I'm all right," she whispered, just startled. Daniel helped her sit up, his hands steady but tender on her shoulders. Their faces were close, and he noticed a smudge of dirt on her cheek. Without thinking, he brushed it away with his thumb. The touch lingered, and something unspoken passed between them. Carmen's cheeks flushed pink, but she didn't pull away. For a moment, they stayed frozen, the prairie wind whispering around them. Then Daniel cleared his throat and helped her to her feet. "Thank you," Carmen said softly, smoothing her skirts. "I should have been paying better attention." "Horses." "Green," Daniel said gruffly, checking the animal for injury. "Not your fault." They remounted and continued toward the trading post, both acutely aware of the moment they'd shared. The conversation flowed easier now, filled with small laughs and shared observations about the land around them. At the trading post, they tied their horses and stepped into the dim interior. The familiar smell of leather, tobacco, and coffee filled the air. While Carmen examined bolts of fabric, Daniel gathered their supplies. Then he heard voices from the back room, rough, unfamiliar voices that made him pause. "Old man Boone won't know what hit him," one man growled. "Boss says make it look like an accident. Barn fire, maybe. Shame about that pretty little filly." "Staying with him," another voice added with a cruel laugh. "But city girls don't belong out here anyway." Daniel's hand instinctively went to his gun, but Carmen appeared beside him, laying a gentle hand on his arm. Her face was pale, but her eyes were determined. She shook her head slightly. "Not here, not now." Daniel forced himself to relax, but he carefully noted the men's faces when they swaggered through the store. 3 hard-looking riders wearing expensive boots and carrying new revolvers. Hired guns, without a doubt. The ride home was tenser, both of them watching the shadows growing long across the prairie. As the sun began to set, Carmen finally spoke. "I'm frightened," she admitted quietly. "Not of dying, but of what they might do to you to the ranch." "Because of me." Daniel reined his horse closer to hers. "You ain't the cause of this, Carmen. The syndicate would have come whether you were here or not." He paused, then added softly, "Never met anyone braver than you. Staying to fight instead. Of running back to Boston's safe streets." Carmen's smile was tremulous, but real. "I couldn't run now if I wanted to. This land, these people, they've become my home." As they crested the final hill toward the ranch, they saw lanterns moving in the gathering dusk. For a moment, Daniel tensed, then recognized Whit Thompson's wagon and Tom Wheeler's paint horse. More shapes emerged from the shadows. Neighbors, at least a dozen of them, gathered in his yard. Mrs. Tilson's voice carried clearly. "There they are. We've got the night watch organized. Daniel, 2 men per shift, rotating until dawn." Daniel and Carmen dismounted to find the barn alive with activity. Women had brought food, bread, stew, coffee keeping warm on the potbelly stove. Men checked rifles and discussed patrol routes. Young Billy Thompson was already up in the hayloft, rifle across his knees, watching the northern approach, looking at Carmen's face in the lantern light, seeing her welcomed and accepted by these hardy frontier folk. Daniel felt something shift in his heart. The ranch had always been his refuge, his solitary kingdom. Now, watching Carmen move among their neighbors, sharing coffee and quiet words of thanks, he saw a different future taking shape. It wasn't just about surviving anymore, about holding onto his parents' legacy alone. With Carmen beside him, the ranch could become something more, a home filled with warmth and purpose. A place where community gathered and hope flourished. The night settled around them, stars pricking through the darkening sky. Carmen stood at his shoulder, her presence as natural as breathing. Together they watched their neighbors prepare to defend not just a ranch, but the promise of something worth fighting for. The morning sun filtered through the cabin windows as Carmen stirred a pot of oatmeal on the wood stove. She had risen early, determined to have a hot breakfast ready when Daniel returned from checking the cattle. The coffee perked steadily, filling the small space with its rich aroma. Hours ticked by. The oatmeal grew cold. Carmen's eyes kept drifting to the window, searching the distant pastures. Daniel should have returned by now. He always came back, before the sun climbed too high. By midday, worry gnawed at her stomach. She paced the worn floorboards, then made her decision. Within minutes, she had saddled the bay mare Daniel had been teaching her to ride. The horse sensed her anxiety, dancing sideways as Carmen swung into the saddle. "Easy, girl," Carmen murmured, gathering the reins. She'd watched Daniel track cattle enough times to recognize signs. Broken grass, hoof prints in the soft earth. Following his trail, she urged the mare toward the north pasture where he'd planned to check the herd. The afternoon sun beat down as Carmen rode, her eyes scanning the ground. Fresh tracks led toward a narrow draw between 2 hills. Something wasn't right. Daniel's horse had been walking steadily. Then the prince showed a sudden scatter, as if the animal had spooked. Rounding a bend, Carmen's heart stopped. Daniel lay crumpled beside a boulder, his horse nowhere in sight. Blood darkened his shirt around his left shoulder. "Daniel!" She scrambled from her saddle, dropping to her knees beside him. His face was gray with pain, but his eyes flickered, open at her touch. "Carmen?" His voice came rough. "Shouldn't be here. Might come back." "Who did this?" She pressed her handkerchief against the wound, trying to stem the bleeding. "Syndicate men," he grimaced. "Ambushed. From above." Carmen's hands trembled, but her voice stayed steady. "We need to get you home. Can you stand?" Daniel tried to rise but fell back, weakness evident in every line of his body. Carmen's mind raced. She couldn't lift him alone, that leaving him to get help might mean his death. A nickering sound made her turn. Daniel's horse had returned, drawn perhaps by familiar voices. Carmen sent up a silent prayer of thanks. "This will hurt," she warned. "Daniel, but we have no choice." What followed was an ordeal Carmen would never forget. Somehow, she managed to help Daniel drag himself onto his horse. He swayed dangerously, but she tied him to the saddle with her shawl. Leading both horses at a careful walk, she started the long journey home. The sun was setting when they finally reached the ranch. Carmen's shouts brought neighbors running from nearby homesteads. Strong hands lifted Daniel from his horse and carried him inside. "Need a doctor," someone said. "No time," Carmen replied, already gathering supplies. "I can tend him. I learned from Dr. Martha Wells in Boston." Her voice held such authority that no one argued. Through the night, Carmen worked tirelessly. She cleaned the wound with boiled water, then applied poultices made from yarrow and other herbs she'd gathered since arriving. Her fingers moved surely, remembering every lesson from her Boston mentor. Daniel burned with fever, his skin hot beneath her touch. In his delirium, he muttered about cattle, about his parents, about failure. Failed the ranch, he groaned. "Failed? You, Carmen? Can't protect." "Hush now," Carmen whispered, wiping his brow with a cool cloth. "You haven't failed anyone. We're going to fight this together." Tears slipped down her cheeks, but her hands remained steady as she changed the bandages. She prayed as she worked, her lips moving silently. Outside, she could hear neighbors taking turns standing guard. Mrs. Tilson brought fresh coffee and tried to make Carmen rest, but she refused to leave Daniel's side. The hours crept by. Carmen sang hymns softly, the same ones they'd sung in the barn days earlier. She told stories of Boston, of her first time riding a horse, of her dreams for the future, anything to keep him anchored to life. Near dawn, Daniel's fever broke. His breathing evened out, and color began returning to his face. Carmen checked his wound. No sign of infection. The worst had passed. Exhausted beyond measure, Carmen sank to her knees beside his bed. The first rays of sunrise painted the cabin. Walls gold. She watched Daniel's chest rise and fall, each breath a precious gift dot in that quiet moment. Truth struck her like lightning. She couldn't imagine life without him. This rough cabin, this wild land, this brave and stubborn man, they had become her world. The thought of returning to Boston's polite society seemed impossible now. Carmen straightened her shoulders, new determination filling her heart. She would risk everything, her inheritance, her family's approval, her very future, to save Daniel's land. The syndicate had tried to destroy what she loved most. They would soon learn that a Boston banker's daughter could be as fierce as any frontier woman when protecting her home. She took Daniel's callous hand in hers, holding it gently. As the new day dawned, the rooster's crow barely preceded Carmen's rise from her bedside vigil. She stretched her stiff muscles, checked Daniel's bandages, and stepped outside to face the day's work. The ranch wouldn't run itself, and Daniel needed time to heal. The barn door creaked as she pushed it open. Morning light streamed through, gaps in the weathered boards illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Carmen stood for a moment studying the wagon and implements that had seemed so foreign just weeks ago. "Lord, give me strength," she whispered, then set to work. First came feeding the animals. Carmen had watched Daniel enough times to know the routine. She hefted hay bales, though her arms trembled with the effort, and measured grain for the horses. The chickens clustered around her feet as she scattered feed, their peaceful clucking a reminder of simpler tasks, but hitching the wagon proved more challenging. Carmen studied the leather harness hanging on its peg, recalling how Daniel's hands had moved with such surety. After 3 attempts and some muttered words that would have scandalized her Boston friends, she finally got the traces properly attached. "Well, would you look at that?" came Mrs. Tilson's voice from the barn door. The older woman stood watching, approval clear in her weathered face. "Seems you're full of surprises, Miss Carmen." Carmen wiped sweat from her brow. "I'm learning, though I reckon there's plenty more to figure out." "You'll manage?" Mrs. Tilson stepped forward to check her work. "The harness is sound. Now, about them cattle in the north pasture, some of the men are riding out to move them to fresh grass. They could use another hand." Fear fluttered in Carmen's chest, but she squared her shoulders. "I'll go." The morning sun climbed higher as Carmen rode with 3 neighboring ranchers. They showed her how to position herself behind the herd, how to watch for strays, how to call out warnings. Her thighs ached from hours in the saddle, but pride warmed her when old Jim Tucker nodded approval at her efforts stopped by afternoon. She was mending fence beside young Billy Watson, who'd brought tools from his father's ranch. Her hands blistered as she worked the wire, but she refused to quit until the job was done. "Ma'am," Billy said hesitantly, "some folks didn't think you'd stick it out here." "Reckon they were wrong about you?" Carmen smiled, though her muscles protested every movement. "Sometimes people surprise you, Billy. Sometimes they even surprise themselves." The sun was setting when Carmen finally drove the wagon into town for supplies. At the post office, Mrs. Henderson waved her over urgently. "Telegram came for you, dear." The postmistress handed over the yellow paper with careful fingers, marked urgent. Carmen's heart raced as she read the cramped type, examined bank records. "Stop contract signatures don't match stop must present evidence in person. Stop father, asking questions, stop youth, caution stopper." Hands trembled. Here was the proof they needed, but getting it would mean a dangerous journey. Carefully, she folded the telegram and tucked it into her dress bodice. Too many eyes watched in this town. Too many ears listened for the syndicate. The wagon seemed to crawl on the return journey as Carmen's mind raced with possibilities. The setting sun painted the mountains gold, but she barely noticed the beauty. Too focused on the weight of paper against her heart, she had just finished settling the horses for the night when hoofbeats approached the ranch. A rider emerged from the growing darkness, his quality clothes and straight-back posture marking him as no local cowhand. "Miss Whitfield?" His voice was cultured, almost gentle. "I believe we can help each other." Carmen's fingers tightened on the barn door. "I doubt that, sir." "Your father's worried about you." The man moved his horse closer. "I can arrange safe passage back to Boston. All it requires is your signature on a simple document releasing claim to this property." The word dripped with disdain, making Carmen's anger flare. Through the cabin's open window, she could see Daniel struggling to sit up, likely hearing every word. "This property," Carmen said clearly, "is a working ranch. These people are my neighbors. That man inside is..." She paused, truth rising fierce. In her heart, "He's my future. I belong here now." The rider's pleasant mask slipped. "Don't be a fool, girl. This isn't your world. Sign the paper. Go home to your father. Forget this frontier nonsense." "No." Carmen stepped forward, letting moonlight fall across her face. "My world is wherever I choose to make it. Now get off this land." For a long moment, the man studied her. Then he wheeled his horse, darkness swallowing him as quickly as it had delivered him. Carmen's legs shook as she hurried inside. Daniel was propped against his pillows, fever still bright in his eyes, but pride brighter. "Did you mean it?" he asked hoarsely. "About belonging here?" Carmen sat beside him, taking his rough hand in both of hers, every word. "I've been thinking about what makes a home. It's not fancy buildings or proper manners. It's having something worth fighting for, someone worth staying for." Daniel's fingers tightened around hers. "I've been such a fool, Carmen. Spent years praying for strength to keep this ranch going. Never thought to pray for love." His voice roughened. Never thought love would ride up to my door in a torn traveling dress. Carmen felt tears spill down her cheeks as their clasped hands formed a bridge between them, between east and west. Between past and future, between two hearts finding home in each other, the telegram crinkled in her bodice, its urgent message. Waiting. But for now, in the quiet cabin with night settling over the ranch, Carmen held fast to Daniel's hand and the unspoken vow between them. Whatever storms approached, they would weather them together. Morning dawned crisp and clear over the ranch. Carmen stood by the wagon, adjusting blankets in the bed while neighbors Tom Tucker and Billy Watson secured extra hay for padding. The morning sun cast long shadows across the yard as they prepared for the journey into town. Easy now, Tom cautioned as they helped Daniel from the cabin. His face was drawn with pain, but determination blazed in his eyes. I can manage, Daniel insisted, though his good arm trembled as they steadied him. Carmen watched anxiously as the men helped Daniel settle into the wagon bed. We've got those documents to show the sheriff. Today we make things right. The telegram crinkled in her pocket precious proof of the syndicate's deception. She climbed onto the wagon seat, taking up the reins with hands that had grown surprisingly confident over the past weeks. Ready? She asked, glancing back at Daniel Dot. He nodded, jaw tight against the discomfort. Let's get this done. The wagon lurched forward, beginning their slow journey toward town. Every bump and rut in the road made Daniel wince, though he tried to hide it. Carmen kept the horses at a steady walk, unwilling to risk jostling him more than necessary. The Lord is my shepherd, Carmen recited softly, letting the familiar words of the 23rd Psalm carry over the wagon's creaking. I shall not want, Daniel's voice, though weak, joined hers. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. Tom. And Billy rode alongside, rifles across their saddles, watching the surrounding countryside with careful eyes. The morning wore on as they made their way down the dusty road, the town's church spire gradually rising into view. He leadeth me beside the still waters, Carmen continued, the scripture settling her nerves. He restores my soul by the time. They reached town. The streets were busy with morning traffic. Heads turned as their small procession passed, whispers following in their wake. Carmen guided the wagon carefully through the rutted street toward the sheriff's office. Sheriff Wheeler stood in his doorway as they approached, his weathered face giving nothing away. Heard you were coming, he said as Carmen drew the horses to a halt. We have proof the syndicate forged documents, Carmen declared, reaching into her pocket for the telegram. And there's more. The contract signatures don't match the bank records. The sheriff's eyes narrowed as he studied the papers Carmen presented. Behind her, Tom and Billy helped ease Daniel from the wagon, supporting him as he stood on shaky legs. This warrants a proper hearing, Wheeler finally said, nodding slowly. Come inside and we'll, what do we hear? The smooth voice cut through the morning air like a knife. 3 syndicate men approached from the saloon, their fancy boots clicking on the wooden sidewalk. Carmen recognized their leader as James Morton, the same man who had visited the ranch the night before. This doesn't concern you, Sheriff Wheeler warned, but Morton ignored him. Miss Whitfield, Morton drawled. I thought we had our discussion. Last night, yet. Here you are, causing trouble. His hand rested casually on his gun belt. Some might consider that unwise. Carmen felt anger rise in her chest, hot and fierce. She stepped forward, placing herself between the syndicate men. And Daniel? The only trouble here, she declared loudly, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet street, is men who think they can steal honest folks' land through lies and threats. People were gathering now, drawn by the confrontation. Carmen saw faces she recognized from church services and the general store-good people who had welcomed her, helped her, taught her the ways of frontier life. Justice will prevail, she continued, her voice growing stronger. We have proof of your forgeries. The truth will come to light no matter how you try to bury it. Morton's pleasant mask slipped, revealing something ugly beneath. You're playing? A dangerous game, girl. Best remember where you came from and where you belong. I know exactly where I belong. Carmen lifted her chin. Right here, standing for what's right. The tension crackled like lightning before a storm. Morton's men shifted restlessly, hands near their weapons. Sheriff Wheeler moved to stand beside Carmen, his badge catching the morning sun. Suddenly, the clear tone of the church bell rang out across the street. Heads turned to see Preacher Tilson. In the bell tower, the rope moving steadily in his hands. More townspeople emerged from shops and houses, drawn by the bell's summons. Morton's eyes darted around the growing crowd. Faces that had been fearful now showed resolve, strengthened by Carmen's bold words and the presence of neighbors. "This isn't over," Morton spat, but his threat sounded hollow. He backed away, his men following, until they disappeared around. The corner. The tension broke like a fever. Carmen sagged slightly, feeling the trembling in her legs that fear had held at bay. Behind her, Daniel made a soft sound and started to collapse. "Whoa there, friend," Tom said, catching him. "Let's get you sitting down?" They helped Daniel back to the wagon bed, where he could rest against the hay. His face was pale with exhaustion, but his eyes shone as he looked at Carmen. "Never seen anything like it," he murmured as she checked his bandages. "You stood up to them like David facing Goliath." Carmen smiled, though her hands still shook. "I had truth on my side, and good people standing with me." Sheriff Wheeler approached the wagon, papers in hand. "I'm calling a formal hearing for tomorrow morning. We'll get statements from witnesses. Examine these documents properly." He tipped his hat to Carmen. "Reckon it's about time someone stood up to those syndicate vultures." The church bell had stopped ringing, but its echo seemed to linger in the air, a sound of warning, of gathering, of community coming together. Preacher Tilson made his way through the dispersing crowd to stand beside the wagon. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he said, smiling at Carmen. "Sometimes he sends his angels in torn traveling dresses." Carmen blushed, remembering that first desperate night at Daniel's door. "No angel," she demurred. "Just someone who found a home worth fighting for." Daniel reached for her hand, and she twined her fingers with his, drawing strength from the connection. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they had won a victory. Not through violence, but through courage, truth, and the power of people standing together. The boarding house on Cedar Street hummed with quiet activity as Carmen climbed the narrow stairs, balancing a tray of steaming broth. Mrs. Henderson, the owner, had kindly offered their best ground floor room for Daniel's recovery. But he'd insisted on staying upstairs, where he could see the street through the window. Afternoon sunlight streamed through lace curtains as Carmen entered the room. Daniel sat propped against pillows, his injured shoulder wrapped in clean bandages. Color had begun returning to his face, though weariness still shadowed his eyes. "Brought you some fresh chicken broth," Carmen said, setting the tray on the bedside table. "Mrs. Henderson made it special." "Much obliged," Daniel replied, managing a small smile. "Though I reckon I could handle real food by now." Carmen pulled a chair close to the bed. The doctor says broth for 3 more days. "We're not taking chances with your recovery." She helped him sit up straighter, tucking an extra pillow behind his back. The familiar routine had grown comfortable between them over the past days. Carmen reached for the worn Bible on the knitstand, its pages marked with pressed flowers she'd gathered from the boarding house garden. "Shall we continue where we left off?" she asked, opening to the dog-eared page. "We were in Psalms." Daniel nodded, settling back as Carmen's clear voice filled the room with ancient words of comfort. "The Lord is my light and my salvation. Whom shall I fear?" Outside the window, townsfolk passed by on their daily business. Many paused to wave up at Daniel's window or tip their hats. Word had spread quickly about the upcoming hearing, and support gathered like spring clouds before rain. Ranchers rode in from outlying homesteads to offer testimony about syndicate threats. Shopkeepers remembered suspicious men asking questions about Daniel's loan papers. After finishing the passage, Carmen helped Daniel with the broth. Her hands were steady now with practice, though her heart still ached to see him dependent on others' care. "Had more visitors while you were out," Daniel said between careful sips. Jessup family rode over from Thunder Creek. Said they'll speak. At the hearing about syndicate men threatening their water rights too. Carmen nodded. The truth is finally coming to light, but she hesitated, then squared her shoulders. There's something I need to do. She pulled paper and pencil from her apron pocket. I'm writing to my father. Daniel went very still. You? Sure, that's wise. He needs to know what his business partners are doing out here. The real truth, not what they're telling Boston investors. Carmen's pencil moved across the paper with determination. He's a good man, Daniel. He needs to see through their lies. The telegram took shape slowly as Carmen chose each word with care. She described the forged documents, the threats, the violence against honest ranchers. Finally, she wrote, of her own choice to stay and fight for justice, no matter the cost to her social standing. There, she said softly, reading it over one final time. Truth plain as day. Daniel reached for her hand with his good arm. You're risking much, sending that. Some risks are worth taking, Carmen replied. Squeezing his fingers gently dot the next 3 days passed in a rhythm of recovery. Carmen split. Her time between tending Daniel, helping gather testimony for the hearing, and anxiously checking the telegraph office. On the fourth afternoon, as she sat reading to Daniel about David's victory over Goliath, quick footsteps sounded in the hallway. Mrs. Henderson appeared in the doorway, waving a yellow telegram envelope. Just came for you, dear. Carmen's hands trembled as she broke the seal. Daniel pushed himself straighter, watching her face as she read. Tears spilled down her cheeks. Carmen? Daniel's voice was tight with concern. He believes me, she whispered. Listen, horrified by report of syndicate actions, stop. Will withdraw all bank support. Immediately stop. Proud of your courage standing for truth. Stop. You have my full blessing for whatever path you choose. Stop. All my love. Father. She pressed the telegram to her heart, years of tension releasing in those few precious words. He understands. He's not angry or ashamed. He's proud of me. Daniel's face softened with relief and something deeper. Of course he is. Who wouldn't be proud of such a daughter? Such a daughter. Carmen wiped her eyes, laughing through tears. I was so afraid. I thought choosing this life, she met his gaze. I thought it meant losing my family forever. Reckon some bonds run deeper than society rules, Daniel said quietly. He shifted in the bed, wincing slightly as he reached for her hand. Speaking of choosing life paths, Carmen's heart quickened at his tone. All these days lying here, I've had time to think, he continued. Used to believe I was meant for solitude, that I'd work the ranch alone till my dying day, just me and the land. He drew a careful breath. Now I see a different future. If you consider sharing it. Carmen's fingers tightened around his. Daniel Boone, are you asking what I think you're asking? A flush colored his cheeks. Reckon I'm not doing it proper. Laid up in this bed. But yes, I am, or starting to, at least. His thumb traced circles. On her palm. Would you be willing to hear me out proper, once I'm back on my feet? Joy bubbled up in Carmen's chest like a spring. I would be very willing indeed. The late afternoon sun painted the room in gold as they sat together, hands clasped, hearts fuller than either had dreamed possible weeks ago. Later, as evening approached, Daniel felt strong enough to move to the boarding house's front porch. Carmen helped him settle into a cushioned rocking chair, wrapping a quilt around his shoulders against the cooling air. They watched lanterns being lit along the street, each flame a tiny beacon in the gathering dusk. Somewhere a guitar played softly, and the smell of baking bread drifted from the kitchen. Carmen sat beside Daniel, their shoulders touching, sharing the quiet moment. Feels like home, Daniel murmured, watching the town settle into evening routines. Carmen smiled, understanding he meant more than just the place. Yes, she said softly, it does. Morning sun streamed through the courthouse windows as people filled the wooden benches. Carmen sat beside Daniel in the front row, her hand steady on his arm as he leaned heavily on his cane. Though still pale from his injury, determination showed in every line of his face. The syndicate's lawyer approached the judge's bench first, spreading documents across the polished wood. As you can see, Your Honor, these deeds clearly show our rightful claim to the Boone Ranch property. Sheriff Wheeler stood at attention near the wall, watching carefully as tensions rose in the packed room. Carmen could feel the weight of worried glances from neighbors and friends. When her turn came, Carmen rose with quiet grace. Your Honor, I have evidence that proves those documents are forged. She withdrew the telegram from her pocket, hands steady as she presented it. This communication from the Boston Banking Association confirmed systematic fraud by the syndicate representatives. Murmurs rippled through the courthouse as the sheriff stepped forward to examine the telegram. One by one, witnesses approached to testify, Mrs. Tilson describing the poisoned cattle, young ranch hands detailing nighttime sabotage, and traders reporting threats they'd overheard. The syndicate's hired guns shifted restlessly near the door as more evidence mounted against them. Daniel pressed his shoulder against Carmen's, drawing strength from her presence. The sheriff cleared his throat. Based on this evidence, I'm ruling the syndicate's claim invalid. The Boone Ranch remains, rightfully with its owner. Before the words fully settled, the hired guns reached for their weapons. But they froze as townspeople and native neighbors rose as one, surrounding them. The sheriff's deputy smoothly disarmed the men, while Wheeler kept his own pistol trained. On them, applause erupted through the courthouse. Daniel stood tall despite his weakness, pride and gratitude clear in his eyes as he gazed at Carmen. She felt tears of relief threatening but held them back, knowing they'd won more than just the ranch. They'd won their future together. Daniel's whispered prayer of thanksgiving was nearly lost in the celebration. But Carmen caught the words. Thank you, Lord, for this land, and for sending an angel to help protect it. Carmen's heart swelled with certainty. This was where she belonged, beside this man on this wild frontier, building a life of purpose and love. Spring breezes carried the scent of wildflowers across the Colorado range as life settled into peaceful rhythms at the Boone Ranch. Daniel's strength returned day by day, his steps growing steadier as he worked alongside Carmen in the warming sunshine. Neighbors arrived with tools and lumber, the sound of hammering echoing across the valley as they helped rebuild the damaged barn. Carmen watched Daniel direct the work from the porch, his voice growing stronger each day. She smiled, remembering how different everything had felt when she first arrived at his door those months ago, dotting quiet moments between chores. Carmen penned careful letters to her father in Boston, describing her decision to stay in Colorado. Her quill moved steadily across the paper as she explained how the frontier had changed her, how she had found purpose in this wild land. Together, she and Daniel fell into an easy routine. He showed her how to hold calves steady for branding, his hands gentle as he guided hers. In the fresh-turned earth near the house, they planted neat rows of vegetables for a spring garden. Carmen's fingers, once suited only for embroidery, grew familiar with the feel of soil and seeds. I reckon that row's a mite crooked, Daniel teased as Carmen finished planting carrots. She laughed, brushing dirt from her skirts. Well, they'll taste just fine, straight or crooked. One evening, as golden light spilled through the cabin windows, they shared a simple supper of beans and cornbread. Daniel seemed unusually quiet, his eyes studying Carmen's face as she poured coffee into tin cups. Been thinking, he said, finally, his deep voice soft. Would you consider making this ranch your permanent home? Carmen's cheeks flushed pink as she set down the coffee pot. Yes, she answered carefully, if you wish me here as more than just a guest. Daniel pushed back his chair and stood, crossing to where she sat. His weathered hand covered hers, warm and strong against her fingers. As my wife, he said simply, his eyes full of hope and love. Joy spilled down Carmen's cheeks in silent tears as she nodded, her heart too full for words. They stood together in the lamp light, their shadows merging on the cabin wall, while outside the evening star rose over their shared tomorrow. Spring painted the Colorado Valley in delicate colors. Wild roses dotted the hillsides, and meadowlarks sang from fence posts as townsfolk gathered at the whitewashed church. Sunlight streamed through plain glass windows, Warming the wooden pews where neighbors sat shoulder to shoulder, Dot Carmen stood radiant in a modest white gown, her dark hair crowned with tiny wildflowers. Daniel waited at the altar in his freshly pressed Sunday suit, his weathered hands clasped before him. His eyes never left Carmen as she walked down the short aisle, carrying a bouquet of prairie blooms. The preacher's words rang clear through the one-room church as the couple joined hands. Their vows, simple but heartfelt, echoed against the wooden walls. When Daniel slipped the plain gold band onto Carmen's finger, Mrs. Tilson dabbed her eyes with a handkerchief. As the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, spontaneous applause filled the little church. Outside, beneath flowering apple trees, neighbors shared plates of fried chicken, fresh bread, and Mrs. Tilson's best pies. A fiddle struck up a lively tune, and soon the grass became a dance floor. Daniel held Carmen's hand tight as they watched their community celebrate, his eyes sweeping across the distant mountains and his own green pastures with newfound gratitude. That evening, they returned to their ranch where a new cabin stood, proud, larger, and sturdier than the old line shack. Carmen's hands trembled slightly as she lit the lamp, its warm glow filling their home. They settled by the stone fireplace where flames danced against fresh-cut pine logs. "I only knew country life before," Daniel whispered, drawing her close. "Now I know love." Carmen smiled and rested her head on his shoulder, their shadows merging on the cabin wall as the frontier night wrapped them in its peaceful embrace. If today's story reminded you of the quiet strength of love, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe, and tomorrow we'll meet right here, where love speaks softly and stays.